To start our California edition, my name is Brad Pomerantz. I am so glad you are with us. Over this half hour, we are going to be speaking with Darrell Steinberg. Of course, he is the President Pro Tem of the California State Senate. We're going to speak with him about his rise through politics, starting from Millbrae, California, all the way up to Sacramento. We'll also be speaking with him about various issues facing the state of California, including the budget, taxes, and of course, cries for reform in the halls of Sacramento. Darrell Steinberg, thank you for joining us on California Edition. I appreciate it. Let's start from the beginning and talk about where you were from, where you were born, your childhood briefly.
I grew up in Millbrae, California, just south of San Francisco, and I grew up in a pretty middle-class neighborhood, and I graduated high school 1977, the year before Prop 13 passed.
Right, kind of in the middle of the Vietnam era, a lot of contention, dissension. Did you come from a political family?
I did not come from a political family. I came from an involved family, but not very political. But from an early age, I kind of had the bug.
You did?
I don't know. I had the
way early on.
I had the interest, and I grew up. And I say that Prop 13 because I grew up at a time where we weren't wealthy, but the community provided a lot. The rec center was always open, the library. My life was defined by the 3 sports seasons, baseball, football, and basketball. I became a tennis player, and I never had time to get in trouble, even if I wanted to, because there was a lot going on. And you know, a lot of what I experienced, that sense of community, you know, I think has been not lost, but it's different for the successive generations.
I remember I was in junior high school when Prop 13 passed, and the first thing that happened was we had to pay for school buses, which was tough for some families, and some sports programs got cut. So I understand what you're saying. I can remember how it personally affected me as a junior high school student. You ultimately went to Cal and UCLA.
I did.
Came to Sacramento for law school.
Well, I went to UC Davis Law School, and you know, fate, your decisions. I had a choice to either go to Hastings or UC Davis. I chose Davis because I wanted a campus, and that choice led me to my first job in Sacramento. And the job didn't last very long, but I love Sacramento, and the rest is history, as they say.
You became an employee rights attorney, I understand,
did.
And you worked for the California State Employees Association.
That was my second job. That's right.
And you worked there for about 10 years?
10 years.
How did those years inform you as you are a legislator today?
Well, my job was to represent people who were victims of discrimination, who were unfairly fired from their public job. And you know, to me, it was like being a public defender for fired workers. And it sort of fortified the belief I always had and still have that you fight for the underdog. You fight for the person who's having trouble.
And what's interesting, we fast forward to now, 2012, and I think it's fair to say that public workers are the scapegoats du jour. And so the fact that you were representing them in the 80s, how does that inform you today when you see that, for better or for worse, it's popular to scapegoat public workers?
I also represent probably the largest number of state workers of any other representative, given that I represent Sacramento. And so, I respect the public service, and I respect public workers, and I think that they have been, in many instances, unfairly demagogued. Look, we're going to deliver pension reform. We have to.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, there are some excesses, but you know, the debate becomes too rhetorical, especially when public workers are demonized. Look, what do you say about the firefighter? What do you say about the police officer? What do you say about the nurse in the state hospital? There are so many instances where you can point to public service and public workers actually being essential to the public good. So I always insist on debating the facts when it comes to these issues like pension reform.
What about the fact that you ultimately became a judge, an administrative law judge? That also has to really inform how you think, your worldview.
Well, absolutely. I did become a judge, judging some of the very cases I had been, a different set of cases, of course, but the same issue area. And, you know, I think that that was a great experience for me because you can believe what you believe, fight for what you believe, but you always got to see both sides.
Of course.
Always have to see both sides. And part of the art of being a legislator and a legislative leader is to try to meld different points of view and disparate opinions to try to reach a common goal.
Interesting you say that, because I think of your years in Sacramento. You served 98 to 2004, took a short break 2006 to today, and I think it's fair to say that over the time you've spent in Sacramento, it's become pretty polarized. I mean, you kind of grew up in the era of term limits. You have a lot of people coming in and out. We have had very partisan primaries. So how have you been able to work through that desire to see both sides when many of your colleagues only see through one set of glasses?
Well, it's not easy, and it is gotten more polarized, no question about it. But, you know, when you live it and you work it and you see good things get done every single year, you know that it's still about the art of the possible. And
is it?
It is. And one of the things I hope that I have brought to my leadership role is that sense and ability to try to, you call it in politics making deals. I look at it as finding the common ground.
And what's interesting about that statement is 10, 20, 30 years ago, making deals was seen as a positive.
Right.
Now you use that expression and it's seen as a pejorative. And so it's almost as if the desire, the goal of compromise is shunned, is frowned upon.
In many quarters it is, and yet it's still the only way to move public policy forward. And every year, every week actually, I'm engaged in trying to find that common ground. It's a tougher environment. And yet, look at, when I became the leader, we had a $42 billion deficit. It's now less than $10 billion. That was not done by me alone or by anybody alone. It has taken a lot of collaborative work between the executive branch and the legislative branch.
But has it taken collaborative work between the executive branch and just the Democrats?
Well,
and you know, which many would argue is unfortunate.
Look, in 2009, which was my first year, which was the worst deficit in state history, Democrats and Republicans actually came together and we passed a budget that included both deep cuts and temporary tax increases. Unfortunately, the two Republican leaders who negotiated those deals lost their leadership, one at 1 in the morning of the vote, the other a couple of weeks later. And that did send a message to other Republicans that if you choose to govern in a responsible way, to find the middle, you're likely to be the victim of real retribution from the right wing. That's unfortunate. That's the reality we live in.
And doesn't that become even more challenging in an era of term limits? Because if you cast off a leader, well, he or she will be gone in 2 years anyway.
I think it is. I think it is exacerbated in the era of term limits. Look, most people agree that term limits, whatever its original intention, has been a colossal failure, the way that it has been implemented in California. Legislative leaders, legislators, just begin to hit their stride and then have to leave. People, I know politics, the word politician is not a favorable word. I wear it with pride because politician is just like anything else, it is a trade. It's something you get better at the more you do.
Yeah, I'm wondering, you know, when I think about when I want to go to a dentist,
yes,
or a doctor or an accountant or a lawyer, I would like someone with expertise, with years of experience. I want a career doctor, a career lawyer, a career accountant. But when you say a career politician, someone with years of experience, somehow in this political system, that's not seen as a net plus.
And look, that's unfortunate. Look, there's a way to do term limits. In fact, there's a measure on the ballot that would allow members to serve 12 years in any one house. And by the way, it wouldn't apply to anybody who's currently in the legislature.
If you're doing a good job, why shouldn't you get to stick around?
You know what? I can talk about why I think I should be able to stay, but it's not about me. It really isn't. It's about changing the system going forward.
And let's talk about that when we come back.
Okay.
We'll talk about Sacramento reform. We'll talk about your decision to become an elected official in 1992. I'm Brad Pomerantz. We'll be right back on Charter California Edition. Welcome back to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerantz. Glad you're still with us. Our guest today, Darrell Steinberg. He is the President Pro Tem of the California State Senate. Before we talk about term limits, part-time legislature, I want to get a sense, how did you enter politics? Why did you enter politics? You were on the Sacramento City Council for 6 years, Assembly for 6 years. You're now in the Senate. What brought you there?
Well, a lot of things, but when I was in law school, a third-year law student, I had the opportunity to fight on behalf of a couple of my classmates who were quadriplegic, who wanted access to the law school's moot courtroom. This was prior to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it was not accessible. And we fought and fought and fought and finally won, and that lift was built. And it gave me a real sense of the power of activism and of getting involved and working the process.
Got the bug.
And so I got the bug. And when I moved to Sacramento, I got involved in a variety of things, the Jewish community, the Human Rights Commission. I started a neighborhood group in my neighborhood. And then in 1992, the night before the filing deadline, the incumbent council member, very popular, called me up at 10:30 at night and said that she got admitted to law school, Stanford, and would not be running for re-election. And so I can honestly say I literally decided to run for office overnight.
Literally.
And was off and running. I knocked on doors, did it the old-fashioned way, won the seat in '92. And it has been an incredible ride. It's had its ups and downs. I've had some great victories. I've had some real defeats. But, you know, I've been in the fight all along.
And let's talk about that ride, because as you know, in the mid-1990s, California voters, actually I think it was 92 or 94, California voters said, we want to limit the terms of elected officials in Sacramento. 6 years in the Assembly, 8 years in the Senate. The idea was we needed to kind of clean house and get a new crop in. There have been attempts to reform term limits. It looked like it was going to happen in the mid part of the last decade. But what happened, some talk radio hosts got involved and it went down to defeat. What do you make of the term limit movement? Has it been a success in your mind in Sacramento?
Well, as we talked about earlier, I think it's been a real failure. It's been a failure. It's one of these be careful what you wish for, right? It feels good in the short run. I'm sure it did to the voters in 1990. But what it has wrought is a legislature without the collective experience to be able to do a better job. I think the legislature is unfairly attacked a lot of the time, because I think every year we produce and we do good for the people of California, but it could be much better.
But do you think that the legislature is unfairly attacked because of how the legislature is required to act? For example, the majority cannot always govern as a majority because, for example, although the law changed recently, you need 2/3 to pass taxes. Recently, there was a proposition that allows 50% to pass a budget, but that makes it difficult. It can cause a lot of intransigence and an inability to move.
You know, I have a vow that I never complain about the way the press or anybody else treats the legislature. It is what it is, and people have the right to be frustrated when their lives are tough, and they want us to do better than what we're doing. I accept that. But on the other hand, I think people need to realize that there are a number of artificial impediments put in place by the voters, actually, that make it difficult and challenging to govern. And the 2/3 requirement is one of them. Fortunately, last election cycle, the voters passed Prop 25, which now allow us to pass a budget by a majority vote. Wonderful. We still takes a 2/3 vote to raise any kind of taxes. And look, what's happened now is, over the last several years, we have cut so many billions from public schools, from higher education, from health and human services, from public safety. Now what the governor and the legislature are forced to do is go straight to the initiative process in order to try to pass revenue. But shouldn't be that hard.
Let's talk about the initiative process, because while some could argue that's ultra-democratic, we go to the voters to get their viewpoints, others would argue that that process continues to hamstring the legislature because we have what's called ballot box budgeting. And so, for example, I think it's Prop 98, which requires 40% of all state monies go to education. It feels good inside, but that makes it very difficult when you have 40% of 100 immediately boxed off.
I would like to see some reform in the initiative process. For example, I think that when there is a proposed initiative, the legislature and the governor ought to have the ability, a window, call it 90 days, to be able to address whatever public policy the initiative seeks to affect. And if the initiative proponents are satisfied that the legislature has addressed the issue, then they don't have to go forward. At least there would be a stopgap. So that's one idea.
How would we get that passed? Do you have to have an initiative to get
Requires an initiative to change the initiative
Well, let
process.
me ask you this.
Right.
The former Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, Ron George, a Republican, has called the initiative process dysfunctional. Those are very strong words. That word is very strong. Do you believe that the process is dysfunctional, as Mr. George says?
I think it is not being used as Hiram Johnson and the reformers at the turn of the 20th century thought it would be used. It was intended to be a citizens' initiative, and now it is a tool for interest on all sides. And you know, if you like an initiative, for example, I must admit to you, I'm happy we have the initiative process in a way that allows the governor and the legislature to work around the obstruction within the legislature on the 2/3 vote in taxes.
But it cuts both ways.
It cuts both ways, and that's fixed. So let's step back from whatever our partisan point of view is, and let's ask what would be good reform. Certainly looking at increasing the number of signatures required for a constitutional amendment or an initiative is one thing to look at. Giving the legislature, again, 60, 90, 120 days to try to solve the problem before a proponent begins gathering signatures, that's another idea. There are more.
What you are suggesting is very significant reform. And what I'm wondering is, should we go all the way and call a California Constitutional Convention? Because in addition to apparent needs for reform with the initiative process, we also have a tax code that, as you know, and this is really bipartisan, needs dramatic reform. The way we tax is not working for California.
It's true. We need to broaden the tax. We need to do two things on taxes. We need to broaden the tax base. The second thing we need to do, though, is empower local government, cities, counties, and school districts to be able to define their own destinies and to be able to raise revenue themselves. Well, the state should be an equalizer. Few people know this, Brad.
Yes.
The state takes 75% of the tax money it raises and it passes it on to local governments, to school districts, and to counties. Why not give them the power to be able to raise their own revenue without a 2/3 supermajority vote, have the state be an equalizer, shrink the size of the state budget, and create a coherent system of taxation?
Well, the governor said in the wake of the redevelopment fight that he would be willing to support a process whereby localities could pass taxes, bonds, whatever term you want to use, by 55%, which is allowed now for education bonds. If he said it, and you know as well as anyone, cities are hopping mad about the elimination of redevelopment. Right. Where are we on this?
Well, it requires either a 2/3 vote of the legislature to put that measure on the ballot or an initiative itself. Look, let me get back to your question about a constitutional convention. In theory, I think it's a very good idea, because I'd love to start from scratch and rewrite the Constitution.
We're the third longest constitution in the world.
Right, but here's the issue. Can't assume that the delegates to a constitutional convention would not face the same philosophical differences, the same strong points of view that those who are elected to office face every day. And so I think it's probably more productive that we chip away at reform. We have the open primary now. We have redistricting reform. We have Proposition 25, which allows for a majority vote budget. We have realignment. I mean, there are a lot of things that have been accomplished. I think we need to keep chipping away.
Why don't we do this? Let's chip away more and talk about taxes. The tax code. Attempts to increase taxes, decrease taxes. Good?
Got it.
Okay,
I'm right here.
His name is Darrell Steinberg. We'll be right back on Charter California Edition. Welcome back to Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerantz. Our guest today, Darrell Steinberg, President Pro Tem of the California State Senate. And we mentioned taxes. And as you know, those are fighting words in the state of California. It's very interesting. If you talk to voters, they seem to line up pretty strongly with the Democrats on social issues, on fiscal issues, on taxing matters. It's a little dicier. And the Republicans have used that effectively over the last several years. Talk to us about your views of everyday Californians on the question of taxes.
Well, I put it a little bit differently because I think what most of the public opinion polls show is that people don't want their taxes raised, understandable, but they also don't want cuts to the public services they depend upon, whether it's schools or whether they have a kid in college and they're having to pay higher tuition,
which is the contradiction.
That is the contradiction. And that's our job as leaders, to be able to make hard decisions. Look, if you had asked me when I came to leadership whether or not I would cut billions of dollars from the things I care about, education, higher education, mental health, services for the developmentally disabled, I would say, no way am I going to do that.
Well, let's talk about...
I've done it.
Please.
I've done it. The problem here is that we need a good two-party system. We really do. We need the Republicans, even in the minority, fighting for what they believe in. But that doesn't mean being so rigid that you could never consider a tax vote, because the truth of the matter is there's only two ways to balance a budget. You cut or you raise taxes. We have cut the heck out of the state budget, and local governments have done the same. We need a little balance here. The voters will have that opportunity in November with the governor's initiative now consolidated with the CFT and the so-called millionaires tax, $9 billion
but let me ask you,
to stem the bleeding.
Let me ask you about that initiative. We do have a compromise now between the governor
Yes.
and the CFT.
Yes.
And one could argue that it's gone back to the old formula of soak the rich. We have the wealthiest Californians being taxed at a higher rate for a longer period of time. And whether that philosophy is wise or not, I don't really want to quibble with that. But what I do want to mention, as you know, part of the problem in California is we rely too heavily on our highest income wage earners. And you know, the Facebook IPOs coming down the pike, amen. But we shouldn't have to look toward Facebook IPOs and the wealthiest have good years. We need to even out our tax base.
I think it's a fair point, and certainly in the long run we do have to broaden the tax base. But the number one priority now is to ask the voters for revenue, billions of dollars in revenue, so that we can stop cutting schools, stop cutting universities and community colleges, stop cutting public safety, and stop cutting services for the poor. That's number one. The best way to go about it is the way that the governor and the CFT and the legislative leaders have chosen to go forward.
Why not Molly Munger's initiative, who is looking to increase taxes on everyone?
Molly Munger's initiative is well intended, but it has a fatal flaw in my view. And that flaw is it leaves a $3 billion or more gap in the non-education side of the budget. So if you're concerned about public safety and law enforcement, if you're concerned about services for the developmentally disabled and others, if you're concerned about higher education, Molly Munger's initiative leaves a huge gap compared to the governor's CFT initiative. And I think, you know, the voters, I hope won't have a choice, because I hope we can still work with Molly, who's well-intended and trying to do the right thing, but we got to get behind one initiative here.
And the concern for the supporters of some increased revenue stream is that if you have two initiatives, we're not going to have three, we're going to have two, they cancel each other out. They
well,
both go
two
down.
is better than three, certainly, but it would be much better if there were one. But look, at whatever the circumstance is, we will go to the voters with now a broader coalition, and we will make the case that on the cutting side, enough is enough. The people are feeling it, and temporary taxes, mostly on wealthier people, in order to fund schools and universities and higher education and public services. I think the time is right.
Is it a broader coalition? When you look at the parties, you have the moderate left, Governor Brown, and the far left, the CFT. I mean, where's the Republicans? Where are the independents?
I think you need to ask them, because we have invited the Republicans, and certainly the governor did last year in the negotiation over the budget, to enter the revenue discussion. They can't, they won't, and therefore you have to go ahead on behalf of the vast majority of people that we represent who are sick and tired of the cuts to all of the public institutions that they rely on, especially schools, especially universities.
Do you feel the voters are ready to pass a statewide tax initiative? They haven't since 2004. In many communities, they've passed taxing initiatives with 2/3. In fact, in 2010, I think 40 of 53 passed locally, some needing 2/3, but statewide.
Well, we have to make the case, first of all. It won't be easy. We have to show them that the money will be well spent. But I do think people are ready, because I think for the first time over the last several years, given the level of cutting, that the people are beginning to feel it. Whether you're the parent of a college freshman who's paying a tax increase by another name when you're paying this higher tuition, whether you're one of the thousands of teachers that have been laid off, or one of the students who are affected and parents who are affected by what's happening in our public schools, people are beginning to feel it.
There's no doubt in higher ed, California's tuition has gone up higher than any in the nation. We know that last year, California had the highest average tuition increase, 21%. We are spending 42% less on UC and CSU, adjusted for inflation, since 2002, 2003. First time ever that tuition paid more of the total budget than the state of California in 2011, 2012. We can recite all these, horrible statistics, but the fact of the matter is we still have a deficit, and we still have voters that are nervous about digging deeper into their pockets.
And we've got to make the case to them. But the initiative itself is more progressive. It largely taxes people who can most afford it. The sales tax increase proposed by the governor has now been cut in half as a result of the consolidated initiative.
Why? Why not keep it a half cent instead of a quarter and have it for 5 years? I mean, that spreads the pain.
I understand. It's a matter of combining populism,
right,
pragmatism, and winning. And not winning to win, winning to ensure that there are billions of dollars for education, higher education. The things we take such great pride in are so crucial to the foundation of California's economic future. We have to invest. We can't cut anymore.
I want to end on this question. It deals with the method in which legislators work in Sacramento.
Yes.
There have been movements, and they're picking up steam, to create a part-time legislature. Many states have them. I believe Texas, for example, has one, and we're always compared to Texas. We became a full-time legislature, I think, in the 60s.
In the 60s,
yeah.
Yes.
What do you make of this movement?
Well, I compare it to term limits. It might feel good in the short run, but it would be a big mistake for California. If you want to increase the influence of outside interests, then make the legislature part-time. Look, California is a nation state, and we're going through tough times, but we're making progress. The deficit, this should be the last year deficit in California. Really? This should be the last year. We begin reinvesting, we begin rebuilding. And I think that's best done with people who you elect, who are fully committed to the jobs that they're hired to undertake. A part-time legislature would mean a nation state like California being governed by people who are on the job just part of the day or part of the year. I don't think that would be good.
Do you think that the discussion of it is background noise, or do you think the movement is picking up steam?
I'm not sure. I think, it's incumbent upon us to deliver, to deliver this year another balanced budget on time, pension reform, to pass a revenue measure to make this the last year of deficit. I think by this time next year, I'm hopeful that people will begin to feel like the state is recovering, that the legislature and the governor are actually accomplishing more on their behalf.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay, his name is Darrell Steinberg. He is the President Pro Tem of the California State Senate. My name is Brad Palmer. Thank you so much for watching Charter California Edition.